Major support for these programs is provided by Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Perfect Building Maintenance, New York Community Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending. Additional support is provided by AVR Realty Company, LLC, Bingham McCutcheon, LLP, Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, Capital One Bank, Cassidy Turley, C.B. Richard Ellis, Chelsea Lighting, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, DDG Partners, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Genova Burns and Gian Tomasi, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Corman Communities, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Site Comply, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, the Wickoff Group, Urban American, and Ackman Ziff Real Estate, Ariel Property Advisors, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Goldman Properties, Moynihan Group, Muss Development, RAL Development Services, the Spandrel Group, LLC, Rosewood Realty Group, Triangle Equities.
They call him Cantor Joseph Malovany, but I call him Yossi. I call him the Cantor to not the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. I call him the Cantor to the world. So today I'm very fortunate to interview Cantor Yossi Malovany.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Yossi, let's talk about your parents. Let's talk about your mother and your father. Your mother came from near Transylvania, right?
Actually, it is Transylvania. It's Siget, Marmore Siget in Transylvania. She came from there.
How'd she end up in Israel?
Oh, she was a Zionist, religious Zionist young lady, and she decided that there was no future there.
So how old was she when she came over to?
She came to Israel, then Palestine, Israel, 1933. That means that she was 21 years old.
So she was 21. She was in Tel Aviv at this time?
She lived in Tel Aviv, and she was friends with Bialik, the famous poet, for a year before he died, and she ran after him for all his cultural events.
And your dad has an interesting story because he came over from Poland, but fortunately he settled in Israel. What happened? Tell me this story.
My father came to the last international Maccabi Games, which were 35, 36. It was resumed again in 1950 after the establishment of the State of Israel. And he was a soccer player with Maccabi Warsaw. And when they finished the games, he went underground because he didn't want to go back to Poland. He went underground. The British police was looking for him for 2-3 days. The boat waited in Haifa. The boat left with the whole team without him. Unfortunately, the whole team is in Auschwitz. And he remained alive, and he remained in Tel Aviv. Then he surfaced.
Now, you said it was interesting that people said your father only bought a one-way ticket.
Yeah.
That was the story.
What happened there was when I received the knighthood from the president of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, it happened to have been at the Blair House in Washington, and it was a reception after that, and he said to me, you know, we discovered about your father that he actually left for Israel on a one-way ticket. So I said to them, well, you see, my father was a smart man.
That's right.
He knew exactly, he foresaw the problems, and that's what he did.
Now, during the war, what did your father do?
My father, during the war, joined the British police, didn't know a word of English, joined the British police and did some work Then in between he sneaked out to Europe on behalf of the Haganah and the illegal immigration to help Polish Jews. He was away for 2 months and returned, luckily returned to Israel. And then after the war, he was of course in the Haganah and he was in the pre-state fighting for the state of Israel. And that's
so in 1941, their oldest child, Yossi, is born, right?
Yes, sir.
And you know, the interesting thing is, your parents, at least they understood at a very young age, you went to the Bilu school. Tell me about the Bilu
You know,
school.
it's an amazing thing. They were not very, very highly educated. My father finished gymnasium, my mother did not. But the idea of education was extremely important to them. They always said that the answer to all the problems is education. And so they made sure that the children, all three of us, all three siblings of us, will get the highest and the best possible education. And so they discovered that I was musical, right away to be tested at the Conservatory of Music, right away studying piano.
So you study piano and you go to the Bilu school.
The Bilu synagogue, the Bilu school they attached to it this beautiful synagogue. And in those years, there was a choir of 40 boys, which was conducted and taught by Shlomo Ravitz, famous cantor whose pupil I was. And eventually I became the conductor when I was the age of 12. I was 8.5 when I conducted Friday night services, accompanied with this beautiful boys' choir.
And your parents, especially your mother, really cared about your music because she sold her wedding ring to buy you a piano.
First of all, my father also cared very much.
No, I understand.
Except that my mother sold her wedding ring to buy a piano. And we lived in 1.5-room apartment in Tel Aviv.
With the three of you.
And all three children and with the parents. And they still put in the upright piano where I was practicing.
So at 12, you're running the choir?
I conduct the choir. Ravitz, my teacher, is still there. I conduct the choir. Equally, I'm studying in the Conservative Music, eventually the Academy of Music, composition, conducting, singing, and so conducting both choral and orchestral. And so by the time I got into the army, I was an accomplished musician academically.
So you get into the army when you were 17 or 18 at this
Yeah.
time. So you go to the army, and in addition to being the cantor for the army, you were also a paratrooper, right?
I was trained to be a soldier.
Okay.
Everybody who goes into the army has to be trained. And then I became the cantor for the army, and I was in charge of all Jewish music elements within the chief rabbinate of the army, and the chief rabbi at that time was the famous Rabbi Shlomo Goren.
Now, the interesting thing is, while you're there, people hear you on the Israeli radio and other things, and at
Army radio.
Army radio, and subsequently there is someone from Johannesburg, South Africa, who hears you. What happens?
Yes. What happened was every Saturday night there used to be a radio program, religious radio program on the military radio, Galei Tzahal. And so I think I sang, I don't even remember what I sang, and Sunday there is a knock at our apartment. My parents had no telephone, nobody in those years had telephones, or hardly nobody. And so he says he's from South Africa, and he saw my father, so he started talking to my father in Yiddish. My father said, no, you probably mean my son. And so they offered me to come to Johannesburg just for the high holidays to conduct services. That became 4 years, four and something years.
But the good part is that's where you met Beatrice.
Oh yes, I met Beatrice there in Johannesburg, and our older son Zevi was born there.
Now, so how do you end up from Johannesburg to London?
The old-fashioned way. The synagogue in Edgware, which is the largest in the, according to the Guinness Book of Records, it's the largest in the British Isles, whatever that means, was looking for a cantor. They advertised it, and I just applied for it.
So you become the cantor at a very young age.
Yeah, I was, 24, 25, something. And huge synagogue with 1,700 members, every Shabbat with the choir, at least 1,000 people at services.
Now, the rabbi who's in charge of that was the first rabbi at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue?
Not exactly. The chief rabbi of England, Rabbi Jacobowitz, was the first rabbi, the founding rabbi of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. He went to London in 1967. I came to London to sing just before the Six-Day War at a big event for Israel's Independence Day. Sang at the synagogue, got a contract on Saturday night, which I signed immediately, phoned up my wife and my father-in-law, and I said, we are leaving South Africa.
And you moved to London.
Coming, and then we moved to London.
So you're in London for a couple of years, and through
5 years.
5 years in Rabbi Jacobowitz.
Yeah, he was in the chief rabbi doesn't have his own synagogue. He usually prays at the synagogue called the St. John's Wood Synagogue, but I was very close. I worked with him all the time.
How does the kid who grew up in Tel Aviv, now subsequently at the age of 32, end up at the famous Fifth Avenue Synagogue?
Well, very simple. There are always opportunities. Rabbi Jacobowitz's daughter got married, and I sang at the wedding. After that, there was at the chuppah at the St. John's Wood Synagogue. After the services, there was a big reception, I remember, at the Royal Festival Hall, and zillions of people. And Rabbi Jacobowitz says to me, you know, there are people here from Fifth Avenue Synagogue, and they are looking for you. So I asked him, what do they want? He says, I don't know. I am only hoping that they are not going to steal you away from me. I said, well, let's find out. Couldn't find them. I didn't know them. The following morning, the president of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, Mr. Herman Merkin, called our home, and he said, we are here for another 24 hours. Can we see you this evening? And we both went over to the hotel. And he says, we heard you. We like you. Come for a Shabbat to New York, to Fifth Avenue. And the rest is history.
Now, Rabbi Rachman was the head...
Rabbi Rachman was the rabbi of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. Rabbi Immanuel Rachman.
Right,
yes.
and besides Rabbi Rachman, you had Herman Merkin, you had...
As president
right,
of the synagogue. Henry Hirsch was the chairman of the board.
Right,
and the synagogue, the Hebrew name of the synagogue is after him.
And then the other individual who was very renowned was the writer, Herman
Wouk, of course. Herman Wouk was vice president, founding vice president.
So, you know, now you're 32, you're here, and you start, I mean, there have been some wonderful, I think the Globe of Canada called you the Pavarotti of
the synagogue.
Of the synagogue. Leonard Bernstein, who used to hear you at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue on the high holidays, said he would sing under the altar with you. And you came here and you listened to Moshe Kozovutsky, but then you got involved with a lot of interesting things over the years. So let's talk about Russia.
Yes.
Let's talk about what you did with Russia.
You know, the Russian issue is something that is central to my life. I always looked towards Eastern Europe, to see what could I do in order to enhance their life, which was a miserable life. And so I went to Romania. In '87, I went already to Hungary with the World Jewish Congress. Then I remember we were just leaving the house, flying again to Romania, when the phone rang, and Ralph Goldman,
from the Joint Distribution.
The legendary personality, is on the phone. He says, I'm coming to New York, I have to see you immediately. I said to him, what is it all about? And he told me the president and some other delegation from JDC was in Moscow for the first time to move in, and they met with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was not happy having rabbis, he was afraid. At that time, I'm talking about 1988. So Ralph Goldman had a brilliant idea. How about music? He says, no problem. So I said, okay, we'll call Cantor Malovany. And as it happens, I was flying to Bucharest, and Ralph Goldman said to me, you know what, our people are now in Bucharest. They'll talk to you, I'll send them a note. And so we were walking in the streets in Bucharest and talking about the idea of moving into Moscow. And in 1989, we flew for the first time. I gave 2 concerts at the Tchaikovsky Hall, which is the Carnegie Hall of Moscow, with the Moscow Philharmonic. And I looked how we can establish the Jewish music, cantorial music, to penetrate into the synagogue and thus enhance Judaism. And so we established what we called the JDC, Moscow Academy of Jewish Music, of cantorial music, and we inaugurated it in February 1990 at a major concert in the synagogue in Archipova Street in Moscow.
You tell me a story about the famed Lubavitch Rebbe,
Yes.
Menachem, wants to see you when you come back from Russia, one of your first trips, and he sees you at 2:30 in the morning. Tell me that story.
Well, what happened was that when I conducted services, Shabbat services in Moscow, of course the press was very busy, the communist press at that time. And I was unhappy, I don't use a microphone on Shabbat, and so I got the microphone out, which meant that all the Lubavitcher Hasidim in Moscow walked a long way on Shabbat morning to hear me conduct service on Shabbat morning. When we returned to New York after going to Tashkent and to St. Petersburg, it was tough, under difficult conditions, but I did it with all my heart. Never took a penny for it, of course. I got a telephone call from the secretary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe wanted to see me, and the appointment was for 2:30 in the morning. At that time, the Rebbe used to see people at night. After that, he stopped, and I spent an hour with him in conversation in Yiddish. He wanted to know every detail of what I did.
And he wanted you to do something, right? He wanted you to make sure that you continued this.
He gave me a blessing. He gave me a blessing, and he said in Yiddish, I will say to you, and I will paraphrase it in English, ihr sollt herumfahren, singen dick, zum überzollt euch nicht. Go around and sing, whether they pay you or whether they do not pay you. And so he understood that in Russia, in all those places, of course, I don't.
Now, besides
and he gave me the blessing, and that was very important to me.
Besides going around and singing, you have always, in the same way that your parents instilled in you this role of educating people, you yourself got involved. Let's talk about Yeshiva University and the school, the cantorial program.
The Bell School of Jewish Music, yes. And I was approached by Dr. Lamb, who was then the president, Dr. Norman Lamb, the president of Yeshiva University, and Rabbi Dr. Israel Miller, to become the director. I couldn't assume it because I was busy with my other things, and I knew that I cannot devote the time. I then decided, they offered me to become a distinguished professor of liturgical music at the Bell School of Jewish Music. I immediately accepted it. And since 1985, I've been teaching constantly. And I have already today sons of my original students who are studying with me now at the Bell School of Jewish Music.
You know, and this is so important, you know, the continuation of the chazan, of the
the tradition, the cantorial tradition.
You know, and I think that's important. You know, you were born on Yom Kippur.
Yes.
The most important holiday, and you sing from the heart. What is the role of the chazan?
The role of the chazan is very simple: is to bring the prayers of the people to God, to convey their prayers to God.
So you're the messenger.
I am the messenger. In Hebrew, it's called shliach tzibur, the messenger of the congregation, precisely. And so, number one. Number two, I have to create a mood, an atmosphere in the synagogue that should be conducive to prayer, so that it should enhance the feelings of the people, so that they should be totally involved in prayer and not thinking of anything else. They should sing with me. My choir in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue consists of about 500 people. The whole shul sings. Fifth Avenue Synagogue is a singing synagogue. Yes, it's a Torah synagogue, but it's a singing synagogue. And singing is very important. And I've devised that system of services that has the cantorial singing, what we call recitatives, the cantorial singing, with congregational singing. So nobody will be tired from the services.
Let's talk also about Israel, Golda Meir.
Yes.
Tell me the story about that, because it's a great story with what happened after the Six-Day War and so on.
You know, in those years, at the time of Herman Merkin, Henry Hersh, Al Jaffe, and others, because they were such important balabatim, important officers and personalities in the synagogue, they were always, of course, in close contact with every personality, of course, toppled by Israel. Golda Meir, I arrived in New York just before the Yom Kippur War. And there was a dinner that Mr. Al-Jaffi had at his home on Park Avenue. Golda Meir came at that time for fundraising after Pinchas Sapir, who was her finance minister, already visited twice. If you remember, there was a man, Jack Weiler, he had the famous Sukkah on the sky. I sang there on Sukkot right after, during the Yom Kippur War. And Golda came and he had a hastily arranged dinner for her at his home. And he told her off. He told her that she doesn't know how to run a country. Where did you study to run a country? You are not a manager. What kind of business did you ever run? You are only a politician. And if you are only a politician, you cannot run a country. You have to be a successful man in certain aspects of business. And he told her off, and she was white. And here I am a kid sitting there listening, of course, not saying a word. And so she sat there and she didn't answer. Nevertheless, said Al-Jaffi, nevertheless, here he took out his checkbook and wrote out a check for $1 million. There were 20 richest Jews from New York at the home. Each one wrote out a check for $1 million. She got out of the dinner. She said she was still hungry because Al-Jaffi made her life a misery. But she walked out with $20 million.
You know, I think there's another great story, you know, and it's great for family.
Yes.
That you told me that you sang in the White House you sang in Congress.
Congress.
Tell the story that your mother and father are with you in Washington, D.C. Tell that story.
You know, it's such a moving story. I brought my parents here a few times to be with us. And my father was already retired then. And I was asked by the Holocaust Commission, it was called at that time, before the museum came into being in Washington, to sing at the rotunda in the Congress when they commemorate the Holocaust Day, Yom HaShoah. And so, of course, we drove to Washington, and I took my parents. And I said to my father, you see, this is Senator Kennedy. This is the vice president. And my father was stunned, coming from a little place in Tel Aviv. It was unbelievable. I think it was already the second time that I sang in the Congress. And after that, we were driving back to New York, and my father was very quiet. And I said to him, why are you so quiet? And he says, how can I not? He says, if I had the merit, if I had the zchut in Hebrew, as we say, we had the merit, to see my son, whom I brought up in a tiny apartment, but pushed as much education as I could in music, Judaic studies, the best schools in Israel, to see my son sing at the heart, the center of world life in the Congress, what else do I want? And he broke down and he started crying. And I've never seen my father cry before.
It was a great stuff.
It's something, but I always wanted my parents to have nachas, to enjoy what I was doing.
Speaking of nachas, you have a little thing on your jacket. Tell me about that for a second.
Well, the president of Poland, again, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, gave me the Commander of Legion of Honor, the Cross of the Merits of, I don't know, it has such big names that I never remember properly. Which was very nice. There was a ceremony at the Blair House in Washington. He was visiting the president, and he called, we have something for you. Come immediately to Washington. We came to Washington, and there was a beautiful ceremony, and he gave me this. This is equal to the French one, of course, or the English knighthood, and so I'm very proud to wear it.
You've seen life has its ups and downs.
Yes.
Let's talk about, we only have a couple of minutes left, but let's talk about when the day that you got sick a couple of years ago, and you continued, you know, you got sick, and let's talk about that, and then getting...
Yeah, that was 2002-3, when I was struck with cancer in my colon and liver. It spread to the liver. Luckily, my doctor found me the greatest oncologist in the world who specializes on these matters, and started with chemotherapy. I apparently responded well, and then I had a huge, very long operation, both on the colon and the liver. And thank God I've recovered.
But now
I'm back to myself.
No, I understand. But you didn't sing for a period of time, right?
Almost a year. Not quite. I would say from September, I didn't do high holidays. The only time in my entire career that I just couldn't do it. I had no energy.
So did you have to relearn how to sing?
No, what I did, well, you have an interesting point. I did get somebody to vocalize with me at home, so that although I have my technique, but I felt that the voice was not quite in the right place, and he vocalized with me, and in no time I was back to the same technique, although he wanted me to do a different vocal technique, and I said, no, I will stick to the one that I got from, when I got it from a great teacher, Alexander Lorber in the West Side, for 14 years. And thank God I've recovered, and I'm already for quite a few years back to myself, traveling and going and teaching.
And speaking about that, you travel all around the world singing.
I do.
I mean, you've done how many CDs and discs? And
I didn't count them, but quite a lot. Okay. There are quite a beautiful, wonderful CDs. There are 4 DVDs. There are about, I think, 11 or 12 CDs, including the famous symphony Mechaya Mitim, the revival of the dead, by Noam Sharif, the famous Israeli composer that talks about the Holocaust and the new life, which I premiered with him, with Zubin Mehta conducting at the Royal Opera House in Amsterdam, in the presence of the Queen of Holland. And so, yes, it's active.
Let's talk about Beatrice and the boys.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
How long are you and Beatrice married now?
46 years.
And you have?
We have 2 sons. We have Zevi, and we have Ellis, and from Ellis, Zevi is not married. Ellis has, of course, the 3 children.
How old are the children?
We just had a bat mitzvah for Sophia. She is 12. Arya is 9, and Naftali is 7. It's interesting that once upon a time, Naftali and Frida, Hebrew name, Sophia, Hebrew name, were husband and wife. Today they are brother and sister.
So with like a minute left.
Yes.
Hashem gave you a gift, and you've translated that gift for the rest of the world. How do we keep this gift passing on to the next generation?
First of all, you just hit on my philosophy of life. I always said, if God gave me a voice, I serve Him with the voice, and that's extremely important. And I say that to my colleagues and to my students. By the same token, I teach the students not only the philosophy and the interpretation of the text of prayers, but what kind of a person to be when you are a cantor. The amount of, well, I don't like to talk about my humility, that's silly to talk, but how to behave in an honest way, and how to know your music, and the chanting, what we call the nusach, the prayers, how to do it properly.
So all I could say is I'm happy that I know Yossi.
And I'm happy that I know Michael.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me.